The wind howled like a banshee across the Montana territory, driving snow so thick Eleanor McKenna could barely see her own fence posts from the cabin window. She pressed her face against the frost-covered glass, watching the world disappear into a wall of white. February 1878 had brought the worst blizzard she'd witnessed since settling here with Thomas 3 years ago, back when she wasn't alone, back when the isolation didn't press against her chest like a physical weight. "Lord help any soul caught out in this," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The wind answered with another fierce gust that shook the cabin's timber frame and sent snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the fireplace stones. Eleanor wrapped her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and returned to her mending basket. The lamplight flickered across patches and darned socks, evidence of a life lived carefully, where every thread mattered. Her fingers, still nimble despite the cold, worked automatically through the familiar motions. Sewing had been her trade in Boston, before Thomas convinced her to chase dreams of land and freedom in the territories. Now it was simply survival, extending the life of everything she owned until spring trading season. The storm had been raging for 2 days. Her livestock huddled in the small barn. Her food stores were adequate but not abundant, and the nearest neighbor lived 12 miles southeast, might as well be in another territory during weather like this. Eleanor had learned to find comfort in solitude, though tonight the wind's voice seemed particularly lonely. A sound broke through the storm's fury, something that didn't belong to the natural symphony of blizzard winds. Eleanor's hands stilled on her needlework. There it was again, a rhythmic thumping against the cabin's north wall, too regular to be wind-blown debris. She set down her sewing and moved quietly to the rifle hanging above the mantelpiece. Thomas had taught her to shoot before he died, insisting that a woman alone needed to be ready for anything, wolves, bears, or worse. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the weapon, not from fear, but from the cold that seemed to seep through every chink in the cabin walls. The sound came again, weaker now. Eleanor crept to the north window and scraped away frost with her fingernail. Through the small, clear spot, she glimpsed something dark against the white, a shape that moved with purpose, not randomness. "Sweet Mary," she breathed. A man was collapsed against her cabin wall, barely conscious, his dark hair caked with ice and snow. Even through the storm, she could see he wasn't dressed like any cowhand or miner she'd encountered. His clothing was different, decorated leather and what looked like fur trim, though the details were obscured by snow and shadows. Eleanor's first instinct was caution. Alone as she was, any stranger posed potential danger. But as she watched, the figure slumped further, and she realized he might be dying out there. No matter who he was or where he came from, Christian charity demanded she act. She grabbed her heavy coat and Thomas's old boots, stuffing her feet into leather still too large for her. The rifle she left by the door but within reach. Eleanor threw her weight against the door, fighting the wind that tried to slam it shut, and stumbled into the howling storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. She could barely see 2 feet ahead, but she followed the cabin wall northward until she found him. A young man, perhaps Thomas's age when they'd married, unconscious and nearly buried in drifting snow. He was Native American, she realized with a start. His long black hair was braided with what looked like feathers and small bones. His clothing, now that she could see it up close, was beautifully crafted leather decorated with intricate beadwork, though much of it was torn and stained with what looked like blood. Eleanor's heart hammered as she knelt beside him. Taking in an injured Native American during these tensions between the tribes and the cavalry could be seen as treason by some, but the man was unconscious, possibly dying, and her conscience wouldn't let her leave anyone to freeze regardless of their heritage. "Come on then," she grunted, trying to pull him upright. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and bone, and dead weight besides. "Help me here if you've got any strength left." The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark brown, almost black, with an intelligence that surprised her. He mumbled something in a language she didn't recognize, tried to push himself up, then collapsed again. It took Eleanor nearly 20 minutes to drag him the few yards to her door, fighting the wind and snow every step. By the time she got him inside, her hands were numb and her lungs burned from the cold air. She barred the door behind them and stood gasping, looking down at the unconscious stranger, now sprawled across her clean-swept floor. Blood stained the wooden planks beneath him. Eleanor lit another lamp and knelt for a closer examination. A bullet graze along his left shoulder, mostly healed but recently reopened, cuts on his hands and face from what looked like a hard ride through rough country. But most concerning was his temperature. His skin felt cold as stone. "Well," she said aloud, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "reckon we'd better get you warmed up before anything else." She began with his feet, pulling off moccasins that were beautifully crafted but soaked through. His feet were pale with cold, but not frostbitten. As she worked, her eyes kept returning to his coat, a magnificent piece of workmanship unlike anything she'd seen. The leather was soft as butter, decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and yellows and reds that seemed to tell a story. But it was torn in several places, and some of the beadwork was coming loose. Eleanor fetched blankets and built up the fire, then set water to heating for broth. As warmth began to fill the cabin, she found herself studying the coat more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each bead perfectly placed, the leather worked to incredible softness. It was clearly precious to its owner, and seeing it damaged stirred something in her seamstress soul. Without quite deciding to do it, Eleanor found herself reaching for her sewing basket. Eleanor's fingers moved with practiced precision as she examined the torn coat by lamplight. The warrior, for that's what he clearly was, given the scars and bearing she could see even in unconsciousness, lay wrapped in her spare blankets near the fire, his breathing finally steady and strong. The color had returned to his face, revealing high cheekbones and features that spoke of nobility, even in sleep. But it was his coat that captured her attention completely. The damage was extensive. 3 large tears in the leather, likely from thorns or rough riding, and sections where the intricate beadwork had been pulled loose. Most concerning was a long gash near the left shoulder, where dried blood had stiffened the leather. This wasn't just clothing, it was art, history, perhaps even sacred. Eleanor had never worked with Native American craftsmanship before, but she recognized quality when she saw it. The leather was worked to incredible softness, probably deer hide, and the beadwork told what appeared to be a complex story. Blue beads formed flowing patterns that might represent water or sky, while yellow and white ones created symbols she didn't recognize but could sense held deep meaning. Red beads were used sparingly but dramatically, highlighting what looked like birds or perhaps spirits. "I shouldn't," she whispered to herself, needle poised above the damaged beadwork. "It's not my place to touch something so—" The warrior stirred, mumbling something in his own language, and Eleanor's resolve crystallized. Whatever this coat meant to him, it deserved to be whole. She might not understand the cultural significance, but she understood craftsmanship and she understood care. Working by the steady light of 2 oil lamps, Eleanor began with the leather repairs. She had deer hide of her own. Thomas had been a fair hunter, though nothing as fine as this. She cut small patches and worked them with neat stitches that would hold, but not detract from the original beauty. Her hands moved slowly, reverently, as if she were restoring a painting in a grand cathedral. The beadwork proved more challenging. Some of the patterns were completely foreign to her, but Eleanor had always possessed an eye for design. She studied the intact sections carefully, memorizing the way colors flowed into each other, how the patterns seemed to breathe and move even in stillness. When she found loose beads scattered in the coat's folds, she felt like an archaeologist discovering treasure. Hours passed. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside, a different kind of magic was happening. Eleanor found herself lost in the meditative rhythm of repair work, her usual loneliness forgotten in the focused attention required by the delicate beadwork. She had to guess at some of the patterns where damage was too extensive, but she tried to honor what she saw, creating harmony rather than disruption. Near dawn, the warrior's eyes opened. Eleanor didn't notice at first, absorbed as she was in reattaching a particularly complex section of beadwork near the coat's hem. It wasn't until she heard him shift position that she looked up to find dark eyes watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Surprise, certainly, but something deeper. Wariness, perhaps, but also something that might have been wonder. "Easy now," she said softly, setting the coat aside and reaching for the water cup she'd kept by the fire. "You've been hurt, and it's still storming something fierce outside." He studied her face for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to the coat in her lap. Eleanor saw his eyes widen as he took in her careful repairs, the neat stitches, the restored beadwork. He said something in his own language, not harsh, but questioning. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, suddenly uncertain. "I hope I haven't— I saw it was damaged and I couldn't bear to see such beautiful work." She trailed off, realizing how presumptuous her actions might seem. The warrior struggled to sit up, accepting the water cup with a nod of thanks. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, his voice rougher than she'd expected, but not unkind. "You have touched my grandfather's coat," he said, and Eleanor's heart sank, expecting anger or accusation. Instead, he extended one hand toward the garment. Eleanor passed it to him carefully, watching his face as he examined her work. His fingers traced the repaired beadwork with the gentleness of a man handling something sacred. "I am called Standing Bear," he said finally, meeting her eyes. "This coat, it was made by my grandmother's hands when my grandfather became war chief. It carries the story of our people, our victories, our struggles." He paused, seeming to search for words. "You have honored it." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "I hope I did it right. I've never worked with beadwork like this before, but I could see it was special. My name is Eleanor McKenna. This is my cabin." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "Eleanor McKenna," he repeated, as if testing the name. "You are alone here?" "My husband died 2 winters past. Mining accident." She found herself speaking more freely than she had with anyone in months. "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, and this land feels like home now." Standing Bear studied her face with those penetrating dark eyes. "It is dangerous for a woman alone, especially now. There has been much fighting between my people and the soldiers, many deaths on both sides." Eleanor nodded. She'd heard rumors in town of skirmishes and raids, of cavalry patrols and angry settlers. "Is that how you were hurt?" "A patrol found our hunting party 3 days' ride from here. We were not raiding, only hunting elk for the winter camps, but—" He shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes about misunderstanding and fear on both sides. "I rode hard to escape, but my horse fell in the storm. I thought I would die in the snow." "Well, you didn't," Eleanor said briskly, covering her own emotion with practicality. "Though you came close, are you warm enough? I've got stew warming and you need to eat something." As she ladled broth into a bowl, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Standing Bear. He was examining his coat with the reverence of a man holding a family Bible, his fingers tracing not just her repairs, but the original work, as if reading a familiar story. When he looked up and caught her watching, she expected embarrassment, but felt instead a strange sense of connection. "In my tribe," he said quietly, "when someone repairs something that belongs to our family, they become part of its story. Your stitches are now part of my grandfather's legacy." Eleanor handed him the bowl of stew, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "I hope that's acceptable." Standing Bear smiled then, the first time she'd seen any warmth in his stern features. "More than acceptable, Eleanor McKenna. It is a gift I cannot repay." Outside, the wind was beginning to quiet, though snow still fell steadily. Eleanor realized that when the storm ended, Standing Bear would leave, returning to his people and his world. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel completely alone. The storm broke on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Eleanor stood in her doorway, breathing air so cold and clean it burned her lungs, watching Standing Bear prepare to leave. He'd fashioned snowshoes from willow branches and leather strips, working with the kind of efficiency that spoke of lifelong experience with harsh winters. "The nearest settlement is 12 miles southeast," Eleanor said, breaking the comfortable silence they'd shared over breakfast. "If you need supplies—" Standing Bear shook his head, adjusting the repaired coat around his shoulders. In the morning light, Eleanor could see her needlework more clearly, the places where her thread joined his grandmother's beadwork, creating something that was both restoration and collaboration. "My people wait 2 days' travel north. They will worry." Eleanor nodded, understanding but feeling the approaching loneliness like a physical ache. These 3 days had been the most companionable she'd experienced since Thomas's death. Standing Bear was a thoughtful man, careful with words but generous with observation. He'd helped her tend the livestock, shared stories of his travels, and listened to her tales of Boston and the journey west with genuine interest. "The coat looks good as new," she said, then immediately felt foolish for the understatement. Standing Bear's hand moved to touch the beadwork at his chest, where Eleanor had spent hours reconstructing a complex pattern of birds in flight. "Better than new," he said quietly. "Now it carries 2 stories, my grandfather's and yours." He shouldered a pack made from pine branches and hide, then turned to face her fully. "Eleanor McKenna, what you have done. In my tribe we have ceremonies for such things. When someone shows honor to our sacred objects, they become Washichu Koda, friend of the people." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I just did what seemed right. That is why it matters." Standing Bear stepped closer, his expression serious. I must ask something of you. When spring comes, traders will pass through these lands. Some are good men, but others—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They carry whiskey and bad intentions. They tell lies about my people to justify their actions. If they come here, if they ask questions about helping an Indian, you tell them nothing." Eleanor straightened, feeling a flash of the independence that had carried her through 2 hard winters alone. "I don't answer to traders or anyone else about my Christian duty to help folks in need." Standing Bear smiled at her fierce tone. "That is good. But be careful. Some white men would see helping me as betrayal. I would not want harm to come to you because of kindness. Let me worry about that." Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "You just get home safe to your people." Standing Bear nodded, then did something unexpected. He removed a small beaded pouch from his belt and pressed it into Eleanor's hands. The leather was soft as silk, decorated with the same intricate patterns as his coat, but in miniature. "This was my mother's," he said, "for carrying sacred things, herbs, prayers. I want you to have it." Eleanor started to protest, but Standing Bear closed her fingers around the pouch with gentle insistence. "You honored my grandfather's memory. This honors my mother's. It is proper." Without another word, he turned and began making his way across the snow-covered meadow, his improvised snowshoes leaving a clear trail. Eleanor stood in her doorway until he disappeared into the pine trees at the edge of her property, the beaded pouch warm in her palm. The days that followed fell into the familiar rhythm of winter survival. Eleanor tended her animals, mended clothes, and worked on the small crafts she'd trade come spring. But something had changed. The solitude that had once felt peaceful now felt merely empty. She found herself looking north toward the mountains, where Standing Bear had disappeared, wondering about his people, their winter camps, their struggles. More troubling were the dreams, not supernatural visions. Eleanor was too practical for such nonsense, but vivid imaginings of cavalry raids, of proud people driven from their lands, of a way of life dying in the snow. She'd always known intellectually about the conflicts between settlers and tribes, but Standing Bear had made it personal. He wasn't the savage of newspaper stories, but a thoughtful man worried about his family's survival. 2 weeks after the storm, Eleanor was splitting kindling behind her cabin when she heard horses approaching. She straightened, shading her eyes against the snow glare, and saw 3 riders picking their way carefully across the drifts. Her heart hammered as she recognized the blue uniforms, cavalry soldiers, probably from Fort Ellis. Eleanor set down her axe and walked to meet them, keeping her expression neutral. The lead rider was a sergeant, middle-aged with graying whiskers and the bearing of a man accustomed to authority. The other 2 were younger, barely more than boys, with the eager tension of soldiers looking for trouble. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, touching his hat brim. "Sergeant Davies, Fort Ellis. We're tracking an Indian raider through this area. Wondered if you might have seen anything unusual." Eleanor kept her voice steady. "What kind of unusual?" "Lakota brave, probably wounded. Might have been looking for shelter during that big storm 2 weeks back." The sergeant's eyes swept over her cabin, the barn, the neat tracks in the snow around her property. "We found where he lost his horse about 5 miles north of here." "I see." Eleanor folded her arms against the cold. "Well, I haven't seen any Indians, wounded or otherwise. Been keeping close to home with all this snow." One of the younger soldiers leaned forward in his saddle. "Ma'am, this particular Indian's been raiding settlements north of here, killed a family near Billings, burned their cabin. He's dangerous." Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach, but kept her expression unchanged. Standing Bear hadn't mentioned any raids, and she couldn't reconcile the gentle man who'd helped her feed livestock with tales of burned cabins and murdered families. Either the soldiers were mistaken, or there was more to this story than she understood. "Well, like I said, I haven't seen anyone," she repeated. "If I do, I'll certainly report it." The sergeant studied her face for a long moment, his eyes shrewd. "You're out here alone, ma'am?" "Widow," Eleanor said simply. "Been managing fine." "Must get lonely," the young soldier said. "Isolated like this, a person might welcome any company, even the wrong kind." Eleanor felt her temper flare. "Sergeant, I may be alone, but I'm not fool enough to welcome raiders into my home. Now, is there anything else? I've got work to do." The sergeant held up a placating hand. "No offense intended, ma'am. Just doing our job." He turned his horse, but paused. "You be careful out here. These Indians are getting desperate as winter drags on. Desperate men do desperate things." Eleanor watched them ride away, her heart still pounding. When they were out of sight, she walked to where Standing Bear had disappeared into the trees 2 weeks ago. The wind had filled in his tracks completely, leaving no trace of his passage. That evening, as she sat by her fire with her mending, Eleanor found herself turning Standing Bear's mother's pouch over in her hands. The beadwork seemed to glow in the firelight, blues and whites that reminded her of winter sky, tiny yellow beads like distant stars. She thought about his words. Now it carries two stories, my grandfather's and yours. What story was she creating, Eleanor wondered, and what would be the ending? Outside, snow began falling again, soft and silent, covering all tracks and secrets alike. March brought the first hints of spring, patches of bare ground where the snow had begun to retreat, the sound of water trickling beneath ice, and the return of birdsong to the Montana mornings. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin when she saw them coming across the meadow. At first she thought it might be another cavalry patrol, but as the figures drew closer, her heart began to race for an entirely different reason. 7 riders moved in single file across the muddy ground, their horses picking careful paths around the remaining snowdrifts. Even at a distance she could see they weren't soldiers. Their clothing was dark leather and fur, their hair long and black. Eleanor's hands stilled on the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line. Standing Bear rode at the head of the group, easily recognizable even from half a mile away. Behind him came 6 others, including what appeared to be elderly men and at least one woman. They moved with purpose but without haste, like a formal delegation rather than a war party. She forced herself to finish hanging the sheet, though her hands trembled slightly. Whatever this visit meant, she wouldn't greet them looking flustered. Eleanor smoothed her hair, checked that her dress was presentable, and walked to stand in front of her cabin, hands clasped calmly before her. As the riders approached, Eleanor could see more details. The elderly men wore elaborate headdresses and clothing that spoke of high rank. The woman, perhaps 40 years old with graying hair braided with feathers, rode with the straight-backed dignity of nobility. All of them wore expressions of solemn purpose. Standing Bear dismounted first, his familiar face showing what might have been nervousness beneath his composed exterior. He approached Eleanor with formal steps, stopping a respectful distance away. "Eleanor McKenna," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the spring air. "I have returned as I promised I would." "So I see," Eleanor replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "You've brought friends." Standing Bear glanced back at his companions, who remained mounted and silent. "I have brought my tribal council. They wished to meet the white woman who showed honor to our sacred things." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her chin up. "They're welcome, though I'm afraid I don't have accommodations for so many." "We do not come to burden you," said one of the elderly men, dismounting with the careful movements of age. His English was heavily accented but clear, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. "I am Chief Ironcloud. Standing Bear has told us of your kindness." Eleanor inclined her head respectfully. "Chief Ironcloud, I'm honored by your visit, though I'm not sure what I did deserve such attention." The chief's weathered face showed the ghost of a smile. "You repaired my father's coat, the coat of a war chief made by his wife's hands, blessed by our medicine men. You treated it with reverence when you could have ignored its importance." "I could see it was beautiful," Eleanor said simply, "and important to Standing Bear. It seemed wrong to let it remain damaged." The woman rider dismounted and approached with fluid grace. She was strikingly handsome, with intelligent dark eyes and silver threading through her black braids. "I am Many Horses," she said in careful English. "Standing Bear's aunt. I taught his grandmother the beadwork patterns on that coat." Eleanor felt a flutter of anxiety. "I hope my repairs were acceptable. I tried to honor the original patterns, but I'm not familiar with your traditions." Many Horses stepped closer, studying Eleanor's face with penetrating attention. "Standing Bear brought the coat to me when he returned. I examined every stitch, every replaced bead." She paused and Eleanor held her breath. "Your work shows respect. More than respect, understanding. You saw the story in the patterns and continued it rather than changing it." Relief flooded through Eleanor. "I'm glad. I was worried I might have offended somehow." Chief Ironcloud stepped forward. "Mrs. McKenna, among our people, when someone honors our sacred objects, they create kinship ties. Your careful repair of my father's coat makes you family in our eyes. We have come to acknowledge this bond formally." Eleanor stared at the assembled group, 7 members of a Lakota tribal council who had ridden miles through muddy spring terrain to thank her for mending a coat. The magnitude of the gesture and its potential consequences began to dawn on her. That's very kind," she managed, but I'm not sure how my neighbors would view such an arrangement. There's been tension lately between settlers and—" "We know," Standing Bear said quietly. "The soldiers came to our winter camp asking about raids. They spoke of me as if I were a murderer." His jaw tightened. "There have been raids, yes, but not by our band. Young men from other tribes, angry and desperate, striking out where they can. We counsel peace, but not all listen." Chief Ironcloud nodded gravely. "The world is changing, Mrs. McKenna. Our old ways of life are ending. Soon we will be forced onto reservations, our children sent to white schools, our ceremonies forbidden. But before that happens, we wanted to honor the old customs one more time." Eleanor felt the weight of history in his words. "What does this mean exactly? This kinship?" Many horses spoke up. "It means you are under our protection. Any who harm you harm our family. It means you are welcome in our camps, at our fires, as long as our people exist." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "It also means you have many new relatives who will expect to be fed when they visit." Despite the tension, Eleanor found herself smiling back. "I suppose I'd better learn to cook for larger groups then." Standing Bear gestured toward their horses, where Eleanor could see bundles tied behind the saddles. "We have brought gifts, furs for warmth, pemmican for food, medicines made by our healers, and something else." Many horses untied a large bundle and approached Eleanor with reverent care. "This belonged to my sister, Standing Bear's mother. She would want you to have it." Eleanor accepted the bundle with careful hands, feeling the weight of something significant within the soft leather wrapping. When she unfolded it, she gasped. Inside was a dress of the softest doe skin, decorated with beadwork even more elaborate than Standing Bear's coat. Blues and yellows and whites formed intricate patterns that seemed to flow like water, like wind, like life itself. "I can't accept this," Eleanor whispered. "It's too precious." "You honored our family's history," Chief Ironcloud said firmly. "Now you are part of that history. The dress belongs to family." Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her, weathered with hardship, but warm with acceptance. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly belonging somewhere, connected to something larger than her own solitary survival. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I don't know what to say." "Say you will remember us," Standing Bear said quietly. "When we are gone from these lands, say you will tell others that we were more than the stories they tell about us." Eleanor clutched the beaded dress to her chest and looked into his dark eyes, seeing the sadness there, the knowledge of ending times. "I will remember," she promised, "and I will tell them." The spring wind picked up, stirring the new grass and carrying the scent of distant flowers. For a moment, two worlds stood together in perfect understanding, connected by the simple act of careful stitches and mutual respect. The tribal council stayed until sunset, sharing a meal Eleanor prepared from her stores, supplemented by the pemmican and dried berries they'd brought. As the day waned, the formal atmosphere gradually relaxed into something warmer, more familial. Chief Ironcloud told stories of the old days when buffalo covered the plains like moving thunder. Many horses taught Eleanor a few words in Lakota, laughing gently at her pronunciation. Standing Bear helped her understand the meaning behind the beadwork patterns, how the flowing blues represented the Missouri River, how the yellow circles meant the eternal sun, how the small white beads were stars watching over the people. As the delegation prepared to leave, Chief Ironcloud approached Eleanor one final time. The old chief's face was grave in the firelight, his words measured and careful. "Eleanor McKenna, what we have done today, making you family, this is not just ceremony. Winter is ending, and with spring will come soldiers, settlers, changes that cannot be stopped. Our young men grow angry. Your people grow fearful. There will be blood before this ends." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that you now stand between two worlds. Some of your people will see our friendship as betrayal. Some of mine will see your kindness as weakness or deception." His eyes were sad but resolute. "But you have shown that understanding is possible, even in dark times. Remember that. Hold on to that." Standing Bear stepped forward. "If trouble comes to you because of us, send word through the trader posts. We will know, and we will remember our obligations." Eleanor nodded, understanding more than she wanted to about the precarious position she now occupied. "And if soldiers or settlers ask me about you, tell them the truth," Many Horses said firmly, "that we are people who love our families, who honor our promises, who prefer peace to war. Tell them what you have seen with your own eyes. The next morning, Eleanor stood in her doorway and watched the 7 riders disappear into the distance, heading north toward lands that would soon be forbidden to them. The beaded dress lay carefully folded in her cedar chest, too precious for everyday wear but too meaningful to store away entirely. She found herself touching the soft leather often, remembering the ceremony that had transformed her from a lonely widow into someone who belonged to something larger than herself. Spring advanced quickly after that, bringing the usual flurry of activity. Planting, repairs, preparation for the trading season. But this year felt different. Eleanor found herself paying closer attention to the stories that filtered through from town, the rumors of raids and reprisals, the growing tension between the cavalry and various tribal bands. In late April, Sergeant Davies returned with a larger patrol, their faces grim with purpose. Eleanor met them in her yard, her expression carefully neutral, though her heart raced. "Ma'am," the sergeant said without preamble, "we've had reports of Indian activity in this area, friendly contact with settlers. I need to ask you direct. Have you had any contact with hostiles?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "I've seen no hostile Indians, Sergeant." It wasn't quite a lie. The tribal council had certainly not been hostile, but she could see the sergeant wasn't satisfied with her answer. "Mrs. McKenna, harboring enemy Indians is a federal crime. If you're protecting someone out of misguided sympathy—" "Sergeant Davies," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd survived 2 Montana winters alone. "I know my legal obligations. I also know my Christian obligations. If someone came to my door injured and dying, I'd help them regardless of their heritage. That's not harboring enemies, that's basic human decency." The young soldier who'd accompanied him before leaned forward aggressively. "There's rumors in town, ma'am. People saying they've seen smoke from your cabin at odd hours, tracks around your property that don't look like yours." Eleanor felt her temper flare. "Are you accusing me of something specific, Private? Because if so, I'd like to hear the charges plainly." Sergeant Davies held up a restraining hand. "No charges, ma'am. Just advice. Tensions are running high. The territorial governors declared martial law in some areas. Associating with Indians, even friendly ones, could be seen as problematic." "I'll keep that in mind," Eleanor said coolly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I have work to do." After they left, Eleanor sat on her doorstep for a long time, watching clouds build over the mountains and thinking about Chief Ironclad's words. She was indeed caught between 2 worlds, and the space between them was growing narrower. The crisis came in early June. Eleanor was working in her garden when she heard gunfire echoing from the north, not the single shots of hunters, but the rapid, sustained firing of a battle. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw smoke rising from the direction of the foothills. By evening, refugees began trickling past her cabin, settlers fleeing south toward the fort, their wagons loaded with hastily gathered possessions. From them, Eleanor learned that a band of young Lakota warriors had raided a settlement 15 miles north, burning buildings and driving off livestock. No one had been killed, but the message was clear. The tribes were pushing back. 3 days later, Standing Bear appeared at her door. Eleanor's heart lurched when she saw him. His face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, his clothes travel-stained, but it was his eyes that frightened her. They held a desperation she'd never seen before. "Eleanor," he said without preamble, "I need your help." She pulled him inside quickly, glancing around to make sure no one had seen. "What's happened?" "The raid. It was not our band, but the soldiers don't care. They're coming for all of us. My aunt, the children, the elders, they're hiding in the canyon where we used to summer. But there's no food and the old ones are sick." His voice cracked slightly. "I need medicine, and I need someone the soldiers might listen to." Eleanor stared at him, understanding what he was asking. "You want me to speak for you? To the cavalry? You're a respected settler. If you told them our band had nothing to do with the raids, that we're not hostile." He stopped, seeing her expression. "I know it's dangerous for you. I know what I'm asking." Eleanor thought of Chief Ironclad's words about standing between 2 worlds. She thought of many horses' gentle hands teaching her beadwork patterns. She thought of the beaded dress in her cedar chest and what it represented. "I'll do it," she said quietly. Standing Bear's relief was visible. "Eleanor, but not just for you," she continued. "For all of them, the children, the elders, for the idea that maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to coexist." The next morning, Eleanor rode into Fort Ellis, wearing the beaded dress under her traveling coat. She carried the sacred pouch many horses had given her, filled now with a written testimony of everything she'd witnessed, the tribal council's peaceful intentions, their offers of friendship, their desire to avoid bloodshed. The meeting with Colonel Brennan was tense, difficult, and ultimately incomplete. Eleanor could not prevent the larger tragedy that was unfolding across the territories, but her testimony did save Standing Bear's band from immediate pursuit, buying them time to reach the reservation peacefully rather than as prisoners. Years later, when Eleanor was an old woman living in the growing town that had sprung up around the fort, she would tell visitors about the winter a Lakota warrior collapsed in her blizzard and how mending his coat had changed her life. She kept the beaded dress carefully preserved and the sacred pouch always close at hand. Most importantly, she kept her promise to Standing Bear. She told the true story, not of noble savages or bloodthirsty raiders, but of people caught in an impossible time, trying to preserve their dignity and their family's survival. She spoke of Chief Ironcloud's wisdom, many horses' gentle strength, and Standing Bear's fierce loyalty to his people. And sometimes, when the wind blew right across the Montana plains, Eleanor could almost believe she heard the echo of voices speaking in Lakota, reminding the world that they had lived, they had loved, and they had been worthy of remembrance. The beaded dress remained in Eleanor's family for generations, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can bridge the greatest divides, and that understanding between peoples is always possible, if both sides are willing to see the humanity in each other's stories.